Welcome to Series 2 of The Core with Nathan Fowkes, hosted by Chiu. Nathan Fowkes has been one of the top concept artists in the entertainment industry for over 20 years. His credits include The Prince of Egypt, How to Train Your Dragon, and Wonder Park. In this mini-series, Nathan will get to the core of concepts and ideas that he teaches in his schoolism classes. We hope you enjoy it.
Hey Nathan, thank you so much for your time. I want to ask you again about environments. Now, the thing that I want to ask, and this might be a little bit of a challenging question because I really don't know. What do you look for when deciding on lost edges or very defined ones? So for example, when do you want to do lost edges or crisp edges that have very little difference in values?
Yeah, that's an excellent question because the design of edges is something that I think is underused. And probably the reason it's underused is when we look at a subject in real life, you look at one bit and then you look at another bit. Maybe let's say you're looking at a house. So you look at the door and then you might look up at the roof and then you might look up over at the tree. And so in each of those moments, whatever you're looking at is in focus. But that's not how a painting is. A painting is one focal length. It's one lens, one point of view. It's not because when we look at something, the focal length of our eye is constantly changing. We don't have that luxury in an image. And so we have to ourselves design the edges. So I like to think of it in two very simple ways. The design of edges do two very useful things. One is they create depth. So crisp, sharp edges, they have contrast. They tend to pop forward. Soft, nondescript edges, even lost edges, tend to drift into the background. Well, as concept artists, ultimately we're doing a lot of 2D work that will be seen on a flat screen as a painting. And so we have to be masters at creating the illusion of depth. And so design of edges is going to let us do that in a flat, still two-dimensional image beautifully. The other thing is that we just talk about over and over because it's so central, the design of contrast. The eye naturally looks at contrast. If you have something and you have nothing, the eye just looks at something. You have a white frame and you put a black dot on it, everybody looks immediately at the black dot because it has contrast. And so edges have contrast. So paintings are often a hierarchy. You decide what's most important, what's secondary, and so forth. And you have to visually have the visual language to create a hierarchy of what's most important, and then second, third, and last in an image. Edges are going to be an important part of that because edges have contrast or lack of contrast. And you can do a painting, even a simple painting, and you can take the audience on a real adventure, a little roller coaster ride as they move through to the foreground, then into the background. Then there's a little secondary accent over here, and then there's a little pop down there, but you work it around so they kind of make a circle around your image and come back to a focal area. You can really take your audience on an exciting journey in still painting just from the design of hard, firm, soft, and lost edges. And so it's interesting. I often find that sketching from life informs my concept art, and my concept art makes my sketching from life better. So some people might be aware it's kind of a side thing that I really love. Is doing portraits, painting portraits, drawing portraits. Portraits in charcoal is my favorite thing. Here in Los Angeles, where I am, I've taught classes on the ground for many years, drawing and painting portraits. And one thing that I do constantly is when you look at your subject, you see them in three-dimensional space. But when you draw them, you don't have that luxury. You have a stick of charcoal and a piece of paper. And so I make sure the nose has a crisp focus, the eyes, the mouth, most of all the eyes, because that's where we want to look. Maybe, three-quarter view. And you see a bit of the ear. If the ear has a little bit of a softer edge, that's going to let the more important features pop forward. And so you have the nose and the eyes, and then secondarily on the side of the face, and then you might see a bit of the ear, and you might see the side of the head really feel like it's wrapping around in space in the distance. And you have staggered from firm, softening edges. And all of a sudden, you'd be surprised. It doesn't just create depth, it actually feels like the person has more personality. Because when you look at the portrait, you go for those eyes, and that's the engagement. And you feel that sense of personality because you're focused on the features and the expression. And kaboom, you have something a little bit more special than a mere photograph. Same thing, I remember that even though it's just a portrait, the same idea applied in How to Train Your Dragon, when we were initially designing How to Train Your Dragon. Boldly, if you don't mind me saying so, a boldly monochromatic movie. You know, there's a feeling animated movies need to be pop and colorful and have all of those things, and they should. And I'm in favor of it. How to Train Your Dragon broke that, and it had its moments, but in terms of color, it was a very monochromatic movie, and we would do these environments that had to be very carefully staged in the sense that we didn't have the luxury of contrast of color. And so we would do, you know, all these rocks in the ocean, these big giant pillars of rock staged against Dragon Island. And we would use the design of edges. We would do all kinds of environmental tricks. We would give them all the same shape language. We made all of them feel like they had an aspect of dragons, shapes that felt a little bit dragon-like, so it felt like everything unified. And then we would stagger the edges so that we had that vast, epic, How to Train Your Dragon sense of space. The movie was an epic, and it was our job to create that feel without the usual luxury of contrast of color. And so the design of those edges for that vastness of depth let us get that sense of environment and scale into those places. And I love being able to say, hey, you know, I had a part in that. It's a franchise. It's a show that not only was loved by the audience. You know, the ever complaining critics seem to have really given the thumbs up, you know, to that movie and to that franchise. And so it became one of these career capstones that, you know, I can tell kids, did you see How to Train Your Dragon? Yeah, you know, I did. I helped design, you know, Dragon Island. And it's something to walk around feeling proud of. And those little touches are part of what made it possible.
Well, yeah, that is actually one of my absolute favorite animated movies of all time as well. So it's not just little kids, Nathan. It's also grown-ass adults. I wanted to see if you could perhaps suggest an assignment for everybody to do to practice their edges.
Yeah, good one. Okay, so create a scene that has a series of completely unrelated objects. Whatever you want to do, just things that don't seem like they belong together. And then use edges to help them to unify. I think initially you want to give them space. You know, the scene will have some depth, so you want to do what we talked about to create a sense of depth. Depth is a powerful unifying thing, to feel like there's a volume of space that you can live in. So there's that. And then use hard and soft edges so that they feel like they belong together. The images, the parts of the painting that seem the most distracting, you have the opportunity to lessen the contrast with softer edges. And the bits that really are just a bad taste in your mouth, they do not belong, lose those edges. Maybe that object, you can see the light part of it, but the shadow just disappears into whatever happens to be next to it. And stage that image, use edges to do it. And that ability to take a whole bunch of things that do not seem like they relate and force it. Grab that bull by the horns, bring it down, you know, bring it down to the ground and tie it up, you know, subdue it. Domesticate it. We use that term a lot, to take all those wild elements and domesticate them. When you can do that, you're in the land of concept art, because your clients and your shows throw all kinds of crazy elements at you and say, put all these things in an image and it better look good. And that's what our job comes down to much of the time. So try that assignment. See if you can unify the ununifiable. When you can do that, you wear your concept artist hat proudly. You've earned it.
It's definitely a challenging one. I suggest that everybody try it. And of course, if you want to learn more from Nathan, Nathan has a bunch of courses on schoolism, environment design, designing with color and light, landscape sketching, and watercolor and gouache, as well as composition. And all of these are very highly recommended. They're some of our most popular classes on schoolism. So if you need some help, take up one of his classes.